Well, we are going to be in Psalm 55 today. So if you brought your Bible, go ahead and pull it out and turn over to Psalm 55. That's where we'll be. If you didn't bring a Bible, we have some place down at the ends of your rows, so you can grab that or ask your neighbor to pass it down to you. If you don't have a Bible, please take that one with you as a gift from us today, okay? We'll be in Psalm 55, and if none of those options works for you, you can always just take out your smartphone, type in Psalm 55, and whatever Google presents you, I'm sure will be just fine for our purposes this morning. We don't judge people looking at their phones here. We just figure they're looking at the Bible. So, any one of those three, turn over to Psalm 55. This summer, we have been in a sermon series that we've entitled Knowing God, where we have been examining a handful of psalms in the Bible. And each psalm in the Bible is a prayer. And the person who prayed it took the time to write their prayer down. And then when it was written down, the people of Israel actually would publicly sing it together. So eventually 150 of these prayer songs were compiled and thrown back to back in this book of the Psalms, and they're delineated by their chapters. And so today these are really, really, really old prayers, prayed 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. So if you need help with the math on that, that's 500 to 1,000 years before Jesus shows up on the scene. All right? And they were prayed, written down, sung. And these people who wrote these prayers down and sang them, they worship the same God that we worship today. And so we've been examining these prayers and a different one every week, a different prayer, a different song, and asking, how did this person know God? And when we use that word know, we aren't using it intellectually in the sense that you would know about something. We're actually using it very relationally. There's a differentiation here. We're not using it we're using it intellectually. We're using it relationally in the sense that you would say that you know your brother, your sister, your child, or your parent. That it has a sense of relationship attached to it. We're not using it in the way that you would use it intellectually for people who say, I know Tom Cruise. In fact, that just means you know about Tom Cruise. But if there's anyone here that does know Tom Cruise, I'd like to ask you some questions after the service. I'll be right here. Tom Cruise, that guy's a mystery to me. So we've been going to each one of these Psalms and we're asking, how can we know God? How can we have a deeper relationship with Him? And so we've asked this question all summer, and we've actually come to some pretty surprising conclusions. Often we think of these biblical writers who wrote 3,000 years ago as just kind of almost kind of look down on them as kind of like stupid Bronze Age philosophers. But what we're finding is that the issues they were wrestling with about who God is and how it impacted their lives are the same issues that we wrestle with today. And they have loads to say to our circumstance today as we stand here. All right? So we're asking questions of how did David in Psalm 55 here, he's the author, know God relationally? How did he experience God through the events that took place in his life? This is 3,000 years ago. And how can we seek to grow our relationship with God along the same lines that he did? And the aspect that he's going to identify today in Psalm 55 is knowing God as burden bearer. Not intellectually, just intellectually knowing that God bears burdens, but knowing God relationally as his burden bearer. How his relationship with God was marked by bearing his burdens. He knew God as the person who bore his burdens and helped him carry them. And so David's going to help us see that aspect of God together this morning, particularly through how he processed deeply one of his own burdens. Now, the definition of burden we're using today is very, very loose, very, very loose. And David gives us kind of the license to do that. In verse 22, he uses the word burden. He says, cast your burden on the Lord. And he's using it in a very, very general, vague sense. Literally, this word in the Hebrew means cast your lot upon the Lord. As in anything that has come your way, any situation that happens to you just come into, you haven't planned on it, you necessarily haven't inspired it to happen, but it's just something that is happening to you. So a burden refers to anything that could come someone's way that's challenging and difficult to carry. So think of the things in your life that have just come your way that can be challenging and difficult to carry. recently becoming a parent, a death in the family, a sickness, financial hardship, a divorce. The list goes on and on. But when David talks about a burden, he's referring to anything challenging or difficult that came into his life and could come into ours. In 1985, my parents got married, and they did the very thing that almost everyone in this room has done. They moved to Denver. They got the heck out of Dodge from Tucson, Arizona, and they said, let's go to Denver. That place looks awesome. And what they were doing both my parents came from really difficult family backgrounds. My mom's dad left when she was 1, and she was raised by an embittered mother and whatever boyfriend was living in the house at the time. My dad's dad left when he was 12, and he never heard from him again either, and his mother frequently fell into depressions as a result. These are big burdens that they felt, and so what they did was they moved to Denver. They moved to Denver to create their own life, unencumbered by the burdens of their dysfunctional families. They ran to a city that historically has always functioned as a refuge from the burdens that are on the rest of the continent. First the East, now everywhere. People are coming here from everywhere now. And what are the biggest cultural elements of Denver? What is Denver known for other than its beautiful landscape, its great climate? What have all the runaways from other places come to Denver, and what have they created? What are we known for? Whiskey, good beer, and one of the first states to license and legalize marijuana. And so we have this culture of a bunch of people who are running from burdens to come into Denver, but in some sense they're not escaping them. And we have a culture that has created, and it revolves around these additional sedatives that historically are used to further suppress burdens and run from them. And so when it comes to burdens, it's actually our knee-jerk reaction to run. As Denverites, I would assume that it's even more our tendency, although there is ways you can pursue in alcohol without it being a way to run from your burdens. Don't worry, I'm not going there with that. I would argue that with marijuana, but that's a different conversation. Let's not get into that today, guys. But this is something that all of us experience when we run. All of us experience this feeling to run from burdens. And David experienced it just like the rest of us. This is a human, natural inclination. Look at it in Psalm 55, starting on verse 6. This is David, his natural reaction that he has in light of his burden. He says, "And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hurry to find a shelter from the raging wind and tempest." He desires to run. This is a very poetic way of saying that he wanted to run, right? But we're going to see that ultimately in this psalm, David resisted this desire and instead brought his burden to God. He brought his burden to God. And we're going to see that he experienced great life and great encouragement in the midst of this burden. In fact, this burden, it almost seems as if without this burden, David wouldn't have experienced life so deeply and so richly if he hadn't experienced it at all. All right? And so I think to all of us, especially those of us in Denver who are used to running from burdens, this sounds great. This sounds great. Oh, relief and comfort in light of my burdens. I think all of us would bring our burdens to God if we knew that this is where we could find help. But this is the reality. Often we don't. Often we don't, especially the way that David does here. And that's because there are two attitudes that get in the way of relating to God as our burden bearer. Two attitudes that often derail us altogether. Have you ever tried to bring your burdens to God? Maybe it's in the form of like a panicked request to God when it really bears down on you. Maybe it's in the form of the formal prayer request to that Christian group of friends that you have. But have you experienced relief as a result? I know I've done both of those things and experienced no real relief from it. Somewhere things got off track, and this is indicative that you may have an underlying attitude that's derailing your ability to experience God as burden bearer. Alrighty? And so ultimately, you may feel at the end of that like, well, I don't have anything left but to seek other things so that I can cope with this burden that I have. All right? But David gives us hope in Psalm 55. He's going to show us how we can do this, how we can find relief in life and hope in the midst of our burdens. So this is what we're going to do with our time today, okay? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to unpack David's experience. We're going to look at his burden. We're going to look at how he felt in it. We're going to look how he found relief from it, okay? That's the first thing we're going to do. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to examine the two primary attitudes that get in the way of knowing God as a burden bearer. And third, we're going to see what the gospel has to say to those. All right, so that's our flow. David's experience, our attitudes that get in the way, and the gospel. All right, so let's start by wrapping our heads around what David's burden actually is, what he's actually going through. And he really outlines it starting in verse 9. That's where he gets into it, and he says, "This is my burden." He says, "Destroy, O God, divide their tongues. For I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around it on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within it. Ruin is in its midst. Oppression and fraud do not depart from its marketplace. For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house we walked in the throng." So we see David's burden here is that one of his close friends has betrayed him and taken over the city. David, being king of Jerusalem and Israel, one of his close friends has betrayed him and taken over the city of Jerusalem. And as David looked out over Jerusalem, he saw it in a terrible, terrible state. He says it was full of violence and strife. He particularly said that day and night they go around it on its walls. He's referring to watchmen. He's pointing to the fact that this dynamic watchmen existed on city walls in order to look out and see any danger that might be coming in at it. They had a vantage point so that they could really protect the people within it. And David says these people, these watchmen, are using their vantage point to actually bring violence on the city instead of protecting the city from it. He's in deep despair. The whole population, he sees the whole population as in deep despair. Instead of being protected by the walls, they're trapped within them. They're trapped within them, experiencing oppression and fraud. It even rules the marketplace, is what he says here. The whole economic system of Jerusalem has been overtaken. David looked at it and he saw utter ruin in the hands of his enemy. And what's more is David said this enemy was his close friend. He outlines their relationship in verse 3. He says, "But it's you, a man," verse 13, "but it's you, a man, my equal." A man, my equal. He's referring as king of Israel that he saw this person on equal footing as him, his equal. My companion and my familiar friend. This is the guy who David did life with. He was a companion with him. He was a familiar friend, not just an acquaintance. There's a difference between an acquaintance and a friend, right? The acquaintance is someone you know, and your friend, you know which seasons of The Office they hate, right? That TV show. David says, I know what this guy likes, what this guy dislikes. He knows that about me. We're familiar with each other. He then goes on and says, we used to take sweet counsel together. And this is referring to, they would go to God together and ask God how to live their life together. They would submit themselves under God together. It's a very sweet, sweet relationship that he had. And he says that within God's house, we walked in the throng. This is a strange phrase, but it's referring to the pinnacle of celebration in Jewish society, where everybody would come out together. They would feast for days and weeks on ends. They would just feast together. They'd go to the house of God and worship in those times. And he said that in this pinnacle of celebration, I chose to do it with this guy. This is the guy that I celebrated with. That the most valuable parts of celebration of society, I partook with him. It's very similar to saying that this is his best man. You know, a wedding is kind of the pinnacle of celebration in our society. This was David's best man, or his maid of honor. All right? And David tells us how his best man did this to him. He says how he actually took over. Look at it in verse 20. My companion stretched out his hands against his friends. He violated his covenant. His speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. This man was not only David's friend, this man used his friendship with David to take advantage of him in order to gain influence in the city. He manipulated David. He violated that sweet, close, intimate friendship that they had so that he could take power and oppress Jerusalem for his own gain. This is the burden of David. It's twofold. One, he's experiencing betrayal, personal, relational burden. His closest friend has not only left him, but is working against him and trying to kill him. Second, he sees all of Jerusalem. This is a social burden. He sees all of Jerusalem as being oppressed as a result. And this is the burden. This weird personal public burden commingling is what David is crying out to God from and what starts his prayer in Psalm 55. Look at the beginning of it in verse 1. He says, "Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me." At first glance, this phrase can seem as if David is uncertain of God's willingness or ability even to hear David. Like, hey, remember me down here, God. Please pay attention. Have you ever felt that way? Hey, God, I'm going through all of this right now. Do you even see this happening? And this phrase that David is using, hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Hide not yourself is a phrase that has rich usage in the Old Testament. And God is always commanding his people not to hide themselves from the needs of their neighbors. So a good example of this is this week my wife left the house to go to work in the morning, and she left our garage door open. In our alley, a garage door left open is an invitation for it to be completely looted and even squatted in throughout the rest of the day, all right? But my neighbor across the street hid not himself from that burden that we could have experienced, that danger, and he shot me a text message. Hey man, your garage is open. You might want to go check that out. And I could go and I could fix it. And so David is saying here, God, hide not yourself from my plights. Be the good neighbor that's going to tell me my garage door is open. Look at my burdens, my situations, my circumstances, and be the good neighbor that you've called us to be. I know that you are consistent within yourself and that being a good neighbor is part of who you are. That's why you've commanded it of us. And be my good neighbor, God, please. And David continued to outline how he felt in verse 2. Pick it up in the second half of verse 2 with me. He says, I am restless in my complaint and I moan because of the noise of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they drop trouble upon me, and in danger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling have come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. David gives us a very rich and detailed description of how he felt under his burden. Very rich, very deep. And in reality, all of us have felt these things under burden. Even his burden of 3,000 years ago that is very different than ours carried the same experience of a burden that we can carry on our backs. I'm sure that many of you can go back to an experience of a burden that was upon you or that you currently have right now, something that made you feel the way that David is describing right here. When we're under burdens, there's a complex mixing of emotions, right? But overall, there's a weight that we carry that we feel pushing us down, not letting us live our life in the joy that we want, that we once had, that we can remember even. This can stem from, I mentioned some burdens earlier, but here's a couple more. Relational issues with coworkers, disappointment in the dating game, difficult issues arising in our extended family, ongoing sickness and illness. A full calendar can even be burdensome that just leaves you beat down and tired. A marriage that struggles day after day after day. Even stubborn children can be burdened. But those are all personal, right? Remember, this burden can be very cosmic and public too. It can be the various forms of social justice, social injustice in this world, much like David's was. It can be in the form of racism, crime, sexism, all of these things. And these feelings of burdens are really intense. David uses some pretty strong words here. And undergirding all of it is this restlessness. I'm restless in my complaint. The burden is that continual weight upon your shoulders that never leaves. It's just always there. It's always there, always present, and it influences you as you move throughout your day, throughout your week. Just restlessness. There's the general notion that there's something not right with me, and you're restless with it, and even that anxiety even creeps into your sleep. It even gets right into your sleep. That's like the definition of restlessness. This is how burdens feel, that they grow anxiety within us to the point where we don't operate from an emotional place of health anymore, just with anxiety and confusion. It feels like something's just deeply wrong with us, and something is. There's a burden on us, pulling us back, pushing us down. And as the weight of these burdens continue, feelings of hopelessness, they often emerge. The notion that things could never be any different than they are, that things won't get any better, confusion of our circumstance just becomes really, really prominent. Why am I here? How did I get here? Will I ever get out? The word that David uses here in verse 2 that says, I moan. I moan. This is actually a military term, and it's the term that people would use of fleeing military armies, that after they were defeated and routed, they would turn and run, and they would always yell out in panics of confused defeat. Burdens lead us to a confused, defeating moan within us. We don't even know where the burden came from. We're often confused and demoralized, and great uncertainty takes over. David goes on, he gets even deeper and deeper. He says, my heart is in anguish within me. He ties anguish to his heart. The phrase here is literally, my heart writhes in pain. My heart writhes in pain. There's agony, distress that are leading him to misery and sorrow that'll eventually lead to grief and despair. All very strong, very negative emotions that are produced by the weight of a burden. All of us have experienced these. I've felt these. This is part of what it means to be human, feeling these emotions underneath the weight of a burden. But David's not done. For David, and often for us, after the depths of great despair and anguish, he goes to fear. He goes to fear in verse 4. He says, the terrors of death have fallen upon me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. This fear is tied directly to the circumstance of his burden. When someone takes over your city, usually the leader of that city is put to death pretty quickly. But fear is often the product of carrying almost any burden. We become scared for our future, worried about what is in store for us, concerned really that all of our deepest insecurities will come to their full fruition and rear their full heads in the future. We become scared of losing our friends, scared of being single forever, scared of losing our job, scared of the futures of our children, and the list can go on and on. And these fears they point to the fact that we're carrying a burden on our shoulders. In fact, all of these emotions, the anxiety, the confusion, the resentment, the restlessness, agony, sorrow, all of it point to the fact that something is wrong, and we run from them. That's a very natural thing to do in light of these unpleasant emotions. But these emotions are warning signs for us. They point to the fact that a burden exists, and we need to deal with this. This is actually why we have these emotions. This is why negative emotions exist, so that we can identify those burdens which are upon us. Those burdens that are upon us, and help us identify them and try to fix them. You can ask almost any counselor why we have negative emotions, and they'll almost always point to the fact that there's something deeply wrong and our well-being is greatly threatened. That's why we experience these negative emotions. And here in this prayer, David didn't run from these emotions. He actually brought them straight to the feet of God. And he had God help him identify the burden they're attached to. And so because David brought his burden to God, he found help with this burden. And we see it here in verse 16. Look at it with me. This is the whole turning point of the psalm if you read it from beginning to end. He says, but I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. God will give ear and humble them. He who is enthroned from old, because they do not change and do not fear God. This is a point where David, in his prayer, has found confidence once again. And this confidence is the antithesis of the feelings the burden originally made him feel. In verse 17 here, Look at this. He's confident that God hears him. In verse 16, he's confident that the Lord will save him from his betrayer. In verse 18, he's confident that the Lord will redeem him from death. That means buy him back from death. And like I said earlier, in a coup, the person who is the leader is killed. And so David saw himself as sold to death itself. He says, no, God has bought me back. He has confidence that God has bought him back and will keep him alive. In verse 19, he's now confident the Lord will bring his full-blown justice in the future. And that brings the natural questions. How did David get from this deep despair to such hope? How did he transfer from such deep confusion to such sharp clarity? How did he move from uncertainty to confidence? How did he progress from a deep fear to a deep sense of security? Lucky for us, David wasn't content here to simply show us his burden and show that it was resolved, although it is a really beautiful example of how God intervened in some of a worst-case scenario and brought David confidence and hope again. But he's using this whole situation where he was betrayed and Jerusalem was possessed and oppressed by his betrayer. He's using all of it to make a very pastoral point. He's making a very pastoral point here, using his worst case scenario to make a statement about all burdens everywhere. And it's in verse 22. He says, cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. Remember what we said earlier, that David uses the word for burden here that's so general. It could mean anything, whatever current hard situation, whatever it may be. He says to anybody who would listen to him, cast that on the Lord. Cast on the Lord whatever comes your way and is weighing your heart down. David is urging us to cast anything and everything on God that gives weight on our shoulders. If you're experiencing relational burdens, if you're experiencing family burdens, financial burdens, cast it all on God. David didn't see any burden as too small to cast on God, even though he shows us the extreme example. He shows us that example so we can have confidence knowing that God is able to meet any burden that comes our way. But that leads us to a very obvious question. What does casting your burdens on God actually look like? It's a very abstract statement, isn't it? The word cast to me, when I think of it, is just like I cast a fishing line in the water to hope that, I'll catch a fish. Is that what it means? Are we just casting things, hoping that something will make a breakthrough? But the answer to this question of what it actually looks like to cast our burden on God is very simple. It's times of prayer that look like Psalm 55. It's times of prayer that there's an honest processing of how we're feeling in light of the difficult burdens that are upon us, a broken marriage, a broken society, a broken workplace. It's an honest processing of how that makes us feel and asking God to help us. And in doing that, our burdens become his burdens and we experience relief and confidence again. It's prayer. And more than that, David's challenge is continual prayer. He didn't come to this confidence after a single prayer. Look at verse 17 again. He says, evening and morning and at noon, I utter my complaint and moan. There's that word moan again. And he hears my voice. This is a process that David has repeated time and time again to get here. He didn't just pray once through his burden and honestly process through how it was making him feel just once. He says he did it 3 times a day. And he moaned. He was emotionally present in all of them. He did it 3 times a day. And so David is saying, hey, we need to pray this prayer. If this is something you're not used to, emotionally relating to God, I know that for me, this is really hard for me, probably because of some baggage I have in my past. But emotionally related to God is really hard for me. But David has said, hey, if you're not used to this, use this as a guide. That's why it's here. The people of Israel sang this as a guide. He says, use this as a guide. Write down a few of the burdens that you're currently facing. Then slowly pray Psalm 55. Slowly pray. Start at verse 1. Give ear to my prayer, O God. Show me mercy. Listen to me. I'm restless in my complaint and I moan. When we do that, we start to experience where our burdens are actually coming from. We start to identify the new burdens that we didn't even know were there, but we've always suppressed and pushed down and run away from for so long. They come to the forefront when we pray this prayer. So prayer is powerful, and repeated prayer is even more powerful. Look at this psalm. Nothing outside of this prayer has happened that David could wring any hope out of. He's just been repeatedly praying and processing with God, and that's where he's found his confidence, and that's how he knew God as burden bearer. Now, doesn't that sound great? Isn't that what we all want in light of our burdens? But there are two attitudes that I talked about earlier that get in the way of us doing this honest processing with God, that may even get in the way of us putting the time aside to process through our burdens with God. And they come out of how we react to verse 22. Verse 22 sounded great, didn't it? Great promise there. Cast your burden on the Lord and he will sustain you. But then David moves in and presents an edge. Perhaps one that you identified when we read through it the first time. He says, he will never permit the righteous. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. To David, this meant that those who experience God's burden bearing, the people who actually experience it, are the ones who are submitting to God, his word, and his commands. And to David, this meant the historic Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. People who are submitting to that are the ones who experience his burden bearing. And that feels heavy, doesn't it? Have any of you read through the first 5 books of the Bible? Like that's long for one, and 2, it seems kind of intense, right? But this is what David is arguing here, and a certain population of us runs from this notion. We flee it. We live in a time and a culture where the concept that we can relate to God without obeying his word, without obeying his commands, flourishes, both inside and outside of the church. An argument looks like this. After all, isn't God all loving? Doesn't he love me without regard for my records? Then 1, why is it important how I morally conduct myself? And 2, why would he restrict his acts of loving kindness towards me, including his burden bearing? This attitude, we'll call it licentiousness, argues that a God who is concerned with the actions of his people is actually a very ungenerous God whose commands aren't for the benefit of his people at all, just for himself to make him happy. That for God to be concerned with the actions of his people, that would be incredibly unloving and it would restrict their freedom. And if God did care about our actions, this would be a God who relates to his people through unending moral transactions, where people do good things to receive his love. That then his love would be conditional, right? And so they discard this notion of how God's law works along with obeying him altogether. They understand the righteous here in verse 22 as those who believe a few propositional truths about God and have vaguely committed themselves to a life of love. And by doing so, they gain a free pass to live however they would like to. But here's the thing, when Christians do this, and I've seen it time and time again, they actually lose any form of connectedness to God and his power. You actually can see entire church movements doing this, and their entire church movement loses connectedness to God and its power, and it just fizzles out altogether. And that means when their burdens become overwhelming, they're forced to find other, often sinful ways of coping with them. And in the end, their burdens are actually just multiplied upon their back. They're weighed down even more. But I would be doing you a disservice if we only examined that attitude, because there's another seemingly opposite attitude that inhibits our abilities to know God as burden bearer. And these people look at the righteous of verse 22 that David mentioned and have in mind those who put extraordinary effort towards keeping the commands of God to perfection. This attitude is called legalism, and this attitude comes from the same notion of the law that the licentious person had and that they rejected. That ultimately the way we gain God's love is the sense of moral transactions. That we do good things for God so we can experience good things from him. The only difference between these two people is that where the licentious one has run from that notion of God, the legalist submits himself underneath it as a system to gain God's love and his favor. So they have then this comes with a certain attitude. They've done certain things for God, which means that God owes them his goodness and blessing. That God is somehow on the hook to bear their burdens because of their faithful service. But here's the thing with legalism. When Christians adopt this, they actually heap a few other additional burdens upon their back, and that's of perfectionism and performance. That in turn comes with just a load of insecurity, and you can see this because they end up lashing out and criticizing other people. They feel really insecure about the ways that they're falling short, and so they find other people who are doing what they perceive as worse than them, and they say, hey, look at that. That's where that criticism is rooted in. The burden of perfectionism is heavy. Legalists also end up pursuing other things, often sinful ones, to help them cope with those additional burdens. They just do it in secret. They're plagued with shame as a result. Now, I said these attitudes were seemingly opposite, because in reality, both of these attitudes, though they seem like they exist on opposite ends of the spectrum, actually stem from the same deficiency. We talked about it a little bit in this concept of relation with God being reduced to that moral transaction God. One runs from it, the other submits to it. But they're both misfiring on the same issue, that God is this God who operates by moral transactions. And this notion of the moral transaction God is indicative of a complete misconception of the love of God and how it works. And in order for both of these attitudes to be eliminated so we can experience God as burden bearer, we need a fresh view of God's costly love in Jesus and the law of love that proceeds from him. We need that so bad. And one of Jesus' disciples, his name was John, he's actually called the beloved disciple. He writes about this more frequently and more beautifully than any of the other biblical authors. He says this. He says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever has been born of God and knows God, anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love." You see how he's tying love to the burden of the law at the same time? That's what he's doing here. But he goes on to say, "In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. And this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." Notice a commingling here of God's love for us through Christ, through particularly his death on the cross, and then a command for us to love one another as a result. These are deeply, deeply intertwined notions. God sent his Son into the world to live a perfectly righteous life. He assumed the burden of fulfilling all of the commands of the law and being a human who lived life perfectly. Then God, in his love, sent his treasured perfect Son to the cross so that he could take all of humanity's unrighteousness and put it on Christ, staining his perfection, but making his followers clean. That is the propitiation that John was talking about in verse 11. It cost God everything, but it came out of his love for us. So in this way, God himself assumed the greatest cosmic burden that he ever could assume, all of his followers' unrighteousness. This means that when it comes to God's commands, which are all rooted in loving him and loving one another, you can reduce it all to that. Jesus did. Following them isn't a matter of submitting to a God in order to gain love or favor. His sacrifice of his Son has already testified to his great love. He can't give us any more. There's nothing we could do to get any more of his love. It's already happened. He's already given us the entirety of himself. Now, following and submitting to the law isn't a way to get his love. It's the way to resemble God. It's the way to know God. It's the way to delight in God. It's the way to love God. And it's the way to love others. The legalist stands challenged. Loving God is more than a system of following rules. In fact, you can follow all of those rules and not love God at all. The licentious one is also challenged. God's law is a way to know him, not a way to gain his love. Don't worry. Don't run from it. God's law is the thing that shows us our need for the gospel. Yes. It heightens our awareness that we are in need of salvation. Yes. But once we embrace God's salvation by faith, the law becomes the way to know and grow into the likeness of the one who saved us. To know and grow to the likeness of God, not a way to get his love. And in light of the love of the cross, both of the attitudes of licentiousness and legalism are corrected. We're all able to look to a loving God with whatever burdens we have, not fearing that he'll ask too much of us in light of them, and not fearing and not expecting him to meet them out of some sorts of his obligation because we've been good. The Reformed legalist accepts they can't earn God's love. There's forgiveness and grace for them when there's sin. The Reformed licentious one accepts that they don't have to be afraid of God's commands. They're always still free, always still forgiven. If we find ourselves unable to know God as our burden bearer, it's likely because we haven't seen or experienced our loving God and Jesus on the cross recently or clearly. It means we've forgotten the costly burden on the cross and all of our unrighteousness which hung upon his shoulders, that he took upon himself, that all of our other burdens pale in comparison to. And it means it's time to return to the cross. It's only there that we can fully see God as loving, and then we're prepared to experience him as our burden bearer. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for my friends here today, and we all look to you and thank you for your love. The fact that you look upon us and you love us enough to care about our burdens, and you love us enough to be our good neighbor who wants to carry them. God, I pray that you would show us how we are being kept back from that. What is holding us back from bringing our burdens to you? What is leading us to continue to push them down and suppress them and to run from them and run from you? You are our burden bearer, and we don't want to just say that as an intellectual statement. We want to say it in the deepest relational sense that we can of you. We want to know you as our burden bearer. Would you please give us opportunities to bring our burdens to you? Would you use your Spirit to put the burdens upon us and remind us to bring them to you when we have them? And God, I pray that you would give us a fresh vision of your love through your Son on the cross. Pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.